Welcome to the Phoenix Prosperity Podcast, where wealth meets legacy. Join your host, Tim Fergestad, as we explore the journeys of Phoenix's finest to success and beyond.
At 12, if that's okay.
No problem.
Perfect.
Hello, this is Tim Fergestad. Thank you for joining us. I'm very pleased to have Anthony Solimini with me here today. Anthony is the CEO and founder of AGS Training and Consulting, an executive sales coach, speaker, author, financial advisor, and comedian. Welcome to the show, Anthony.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to be on your podcast.
Thank you. That's a lot of hats, and you have quite the background. You've been back in the States for several years now, but you spent
4.5 years. Yep.
Okay. Why don't you give us a quick snapshot before we go into your background about where your business is at right now, what you do, what your company does?
Yeah, sure. My business right now, since moving back to the States, has been training and consulting, primarily with financial services, but really I've grown to, the sales process and methodologies that I believe in are kind of transferable to all industries. And really it's training and consulting and helping sales leaders get away from the 80-20 rule of sales teams, which to this day, the principle still stands that about 75 to 80% of the revenue comes from 20 to 25% of salespeople. And I can give ways to change that. People don't always want to do it because sometimes it means making some hard decisions, but really just working with firms now that I'm back in the States, could be small, could be large, medium enterprises, but now that I'm back, I like the smaller firms that may not be able to afford the huge training and development programs. They just want somebody to come in and kind of make a quick hit in a short amount of time. So that's what I've been doing.
Okay. First of all, and you mentioned size. Is this like what's a small firm? Is this like 2 to 5 million in revenue, or what's?
I think when I say small, coming from a banking background, it's probably someone. I don't do it by revenue. I do it by more than 5 full-time salespeople. That's kind of how and if you get to that level, you're probably looking anywhere from 10 to 15 up to 50, 60, could be 100, depending on the industry, but. If somebody has 1 or 2 salespeople, it's not going to make sense. But when you start getting volume, and if you think about 5 salespeople, a manager has a very difficult time spending individual coaching and training sessions with more than 5 people, and that's where kind of I come in. Where I don't want to use the term fractional, but it's kind of like that.
Okay. And are there specific industries or fields that you specialize in?
With my background, financial services, insurance, wealth management firms, that's kind of my area of expertise. But I've worked within manufacturing. Did some work last year with a pasta company that sells about $30 million worth of pasta globally. So, it helps having the expertise, but for somebody that's really struggling, I think just getting sales teams focused and understanding their value proposition, what they do, who they sell to, why they do it. There's still a lot that can be done, even if I go into an industry where I really don't know anything.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sure, but it's a wide-ranging skill set, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
How did you get into it? Let's back up.
Sure. That's an excellent question. And I think it's important to talk about where I came from. I majored in mathematics and computer science and at Creighton University, which is in Omaha, Nebraska. And when I first came out, I had nothing to do with banking. I started with, I'll share for purposes of this podcast. I went to Creighton University because my goal was to go to dental school. Okay. I don't know if you're aware, but they have a really good medical and dental school at Creighton. Yeah. And truth be known, I actually did go to dental school for a year at Boston University. Somehow with my grade point average, my interview at the university must have been very good because I did get in. It's a very prestigious school. There was only about 36 of us in the freshman class. It was also very expensive, which led me to make some tough decisions. But with my personality and my type A behavior and my sort of extroverted, even one year sitting in labs and with cadavers and things like that, I realized that that wasn't my calling in life.
Okay.
And after not talking to my father for about 7, 8 months after I left, uh,
Oof.
but the best part of all this was having a great advisor. So my advisor at Creighton said, "Look, Anthony, you may not get into dental school. You may not like it, whatever. Major in something that you love and that you're good at, because as long as you take the qualifying classes, you don't have to study biology and all that." I studied math and computer science. I always had a good knack for that, and I think that was the best thing I ever did. So when I left dental school, I kind of putzed around for a few months, finding out what I was going to do, and I got a job at Colgate Palmolive, doing systems analysis and programming for them. So cut my teeth kind of doing that. Also knew that I wanted to work in sales, though. For some reason,
Okay.
that was, when I got into Colgate Palmolive, I look at the sales and marketing people, I look at my personality, I look at the techies and the operations people, and there was a little bit of a disconnect in terms of me taking it seriously.
Okay. You were in the wrong crowd.
I was in the wrong crowd. You need to have your tribe, and you need to make sure you're around people. But I also think that's a key to my success, is making sure you don't sell yourself short. And I know sometimes we have to make money, we have to do things, but if you don't truly do something you enjoy, I think it's going to be very difficult to become great at it. So a blessing I had was way back when I got a call from a recruiter at the First National Bank of Boston, where I'm from originally, and they were looking for some techies to come in and work in their audit department and write programs for their global operations to run audit reports, analysis, financial reporting. So I did that, and with my marketing, sales, creativity, made it known that I wanted to move overseas. That was another goal that I had, because I had done a short Sorry, go ahead.
Well, you're about to answer it. Where did that drive come from? But I think you're about to.
Yeah. So I don't know why I've always kind of had the gypsy in me. I've always been curious, and had not traveled at all really until then. And then while I was at the First National Bank of Boston, I did a business trip for 2 months to London. And that London trip in 2 months took me to Germany and France and Italy. And I went back to Boston saying, I will do anything to get overseas. And back then, when bankers were respected and making good money, they listened. And within 2 years after that, I relocated to London. That was in 1989. And they gave me a great opportunity. And that led to the path that led me 5 years in London, doing very well there, not wanting to go back to the States, and having opportunities in Asia at the time. And one thing led to another, and I didn't get back until 30 years later. So that's how that happened.
Okay. So that was the 90s.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. And did the 2000 or 2008 stuff have big impacts for you? You were in Asia, I think, at the second time. Right?
Yeah, the 2000 more so, but we were a little protected. I was very lucky being in Asia. Asia still is booming, and back then it was even, they were just desperate and hungry for international people to live there. And now it's changed a lot. There's not as many expats in Hong Kong, Singapore, etc. The mainlanders have done well, and they're coming down. But it had a little bit of an impact, but I was lucky to not have any layoffs or anything like that, and worked through it. I'm not saying the bonuses were as big as they used to be, but not losing your job was a good thing. It wasn't as bad back then. I mean, I just read an article in the Journal yesterday that HSBC, where I also worked, is going through a drastic reorganization globally and could lose upwards of 60% of all their senior management positions. It's pretty mind-boggling.
Wow.
They're taking 9 divisions down to 4 and just decimating that, the gap between the CEO and kind of the regular managers. And really, I mean, that's the nature of the game right now, right? It's a tough business. You can't have the money, the people that you used to. But so I did, I had my ups and downs, but luckily always was in the right place at the right time, with banks that were booming. Because I should also stress that when I lived in London, I actually left First National Bank of Boston, and they did want to send me back. after the project was over, the assignment. So I joined a bank called Standard Chartered. I don't know if you've ever heard of Standard Chartered Bank.
Nope.
It's the number 2 to HSBC out of the UK, but very much structured like HSBC. They're a very colonial bank. They have offices Africa, Asia, all over the world. So when I joined them, my boss in London was being relocated to Singapore, and he and I loved working together and said, "How'd you like to come to Singapore?" I was young, single, etc., and couldn't get over there fast enough. And then spent most of my career with Standard Chartered and HSBC. But yeah, I kept moving, and for the purposes of the podcast, I get asked a lot, why do you think you've been successful? And it's not because I'm smart, it's because I'm curious. And
okay, beautiful.
Yep. I mean, if I eat a food that I love, in the next 2 days, I'll Google where it's from, where it's made, how, it's just the nature of the way my mind works. Right. Anything that I do, when I got my first sales job in banking, I was working in treasury and I knew about it, but I didn't know much. I just bought every book I could learn from, you just have to have a voracious appetite. And this was even before a lot of the internet and things, and I think curious people tend to be happier because there's always something to keep them occupied. Do you know what I mean? There's some people that just nothing excites them, nothing motivates them. For me, I'm always doing something. During COVID, I started my spice company. I love spices. I researched the stuff I loved in Asia. I started mixing my own brands here in Phoenix. Now I have producers in Texas and New York City that make them for me, or in upstate New York. And I have a website. Didn't know how to do that. Spent my time. I have my own websites. I don't have anybody working for me. I do everything myself. And, if you've got the appetite, you can learn it.
All right. I have to ask now, what's the spice company website? What's the name of that one?
I appreciate that. It's my nieces and nephews on both sides of the family call me Uncle A for Anthony. So I created Uncle A Spices, and it's www.uncle-a.com. And I've got all my spices. I've got about 50, 60 great recipes. I've got cookbooks, gift cards. And that was a hobby I did during COVID. And now, I started with one product, and now I have 5 spices, and I name them all. Again, research, memories. I name them all after people in my family and try to make the spice part of I grew up in an Italian-American family. So food for me was not just food. It was Sundays, family, relatives. And so I tried to use recipes that I learned, but I also have a lot of Asian influence because I love Asian food as well. So I think curiosity kind of helped me get through
for sure
a lot of the other things I was lacking.
For sure. Yeah, you mentioned not always being the most academically inclined yet successful. Some of the most successful people I know were not academically inclined. One of the guys I know here in the Valleys, one of his Lamborghinis has the license plate C student on it.
I love it. Well, that was George Bush's famous line, right? I'm a famous C student or whatever. And yeah. I'm not discounting it. I think there's no question academics in certain, you've got to have it for certain roles and things like that. Right. But when I look at the companies I've worked for, some of the Fortune 500 companies around the world, certainly the leaders, not even the CEOs, but the leaders were not always the smartest. They played politics. They had a knack. They knew how to motivate people. They knew how to assess situations. And I mean, my claim to fame is I've had some Harvard MBAs working for me over the years, and I made sure they knew that. No, I didn't. But and this is why I feel so passionate about public speaking and charisma and persuasion, because I've met a lot of PhDs. They can't communicate what they do, how they do it, and why they do it. So you're going to struggle if you want to go down the corporate route, or unless you want to do your own thing. But even if you're an entrepreneur, you got the Elon Musk of this world, pretty charismatic, pretty outgoing. You got to have a mix of both, I think.
Right. Where do you suppose your social intelligence came from? Was that nature, nurture?
I'm going to be honest. I grew up in, I was the youngest of 4, but I had 3 older sisters.
Okay.
And I grew up in the inner city in Boston in an Irish Italian neighborhood. And I think being the youngest, being in a neighborhood where you had to sort of watch your back, not that it was a bad place. I grew up, I don't know if you know East Boston. It's right near the airport in Logan Airport in Boston.
And it keeps you on your toes.
Keeps you on your toes, having to deal with different people. And, but there is another thing that gave me great social intelligence was when I left Boston to go to Creighton.
Okay.
I always joke that going from Boston to Omaha, Nebraska was more of a culture shock than going from Boston to London. Yeah, or Singapore. I was the inner city kid who went to the Midwest, and now all of a sudden I'm out of my comfort zone. I'm dealing with people from California, Japan, Iowa, Minnesota, Florida, Texas, Boston, New York. And I joined a fraternity. As a matter of fact, I had 16 fraternity brothers in Phoenix last week. We had a reunion. I still stay in touch with them. And I learned a lot through that. Just, being around different people. If you want to have a social life and you're with people from 30 different states and countries, you've got to learn how to adapt. So I had a lot of little things that contributed to the big picture.
Okay. You don't normally think of Nebraska as a melting pot, but university
Creighton,
setting.
Exactly. Yeah. Creighton is not a melting pot. Omaha is not a melting pot, but Creighton at the time was. I mean, we even had about 120 students from Japan that were on an exchange program. So we had Japanese students in my fraternity. Back then, it was mainly Japanese. Now, Creighton, you have everything from mainland Chinese to Indians to whatever. It's even more so. So I think I was just blessed. But again, I had to have the confidence to leave Boston, right? Because all my sisters went to school in Boston, very close to home, Northeastern Boston University. Didn't want to leave the family. I just always knew that. And that I don't know if nature nurture, but I knew there was something else for me out there at the time.
Sure. And let's back up a second. You wrote a book.
I wrote a book.
Tell me about that.
Yep. I'm on my third one at the moment.
Okay.
And I'll they're not going to be on the New York Times bestseller list, but I'll tell you why I did it. When I was in banking, I was living in Hong Kong. I knew I was a good salesperson, and I knew bankers were not good salespeople for the most part. Back then, they were more what I call relationship managers. They were good at existing accounts and nurturing existing relationships. But also back then, banking was a lot easier than it is now. It wasn't as competitive. So I had done very well. My wife was working. She's from Iowa, as I said. She was working for Hallmark. She's from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. We met in Hong Kong, actually. So I went all the way overseas and met my wife from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. But I had done well, and I told my wife I always wanted to have my own business. I think I found a niche, and we gave ourselves a budget for 1 year of $100,000, and said, "I'm going to do this for a year, and it's either going to work or I'll go back to banking." And I learned something from it. So I did my research. I wanted to help people with sales and charisma. I just felt I didn't feel bad, but I knew that people that go to meetings and don't talk and are uncomfortable, they're never going to be as successful as they could be, and especially in large organizations. So I knew I needed a brand. So I did my own due diligence and came across Sandler Training, which I don't know if you've heard of it.
Nope.
Okay. Sandler Training is now probably even back then, it's probably the first or probably the second largest now training organization in the world. They are out of Baltimore, Maryland. They started 50 years ago. And when I approached them, I flew to Baltimore on my own dime and spent 2 days in what they call a discovery, which every franchise has to do. If you want to buy a McDonald's, you go to a 2-day discovery where they give you what you get, what you don't get, and all that. And again, being blessed, I found them on my own. They had no offices in Asia yet. Now they're in almost every country in Asia. When I bought them, I bought the master franchise for Hong Kong. I was the first one in Asia. So they loved me. We worked out a good deal, and it helped me cut my teeth on the training. Sorry about that. It helped me cut my teeth on the training, because I knew there's another skill, right? Curiosity. You got to be the best at it. You're not just going to wake up and be a good trainer because you're a good salesperson, right? So I bought the master franchise and ended up running it because there was no other franchises in Asia at the moment. I got to run all of Asia. So for about 8 years, I ran the master franchise and built my career on that and I started doing primarily financial services, but by the end I was doing financial services, manufacturing, IT, pharmaceutical, chemical. I did BASF, Lenovo, Autodesk, Mentor Graphics, because once you have the Sandler program, you have the global network to help you do all these projects.
I see.
And that was wonderful. I mean, I started my training by reading from a notebook. Okay, go to page 1. By the end of the 8 years, just like today now, I could probably do a 2-week training session and I wouldn't need any notes in front of me. I could do a whole workshop. And the difference now is, why did I sell the franchise? Didn't want to pay royalties anymore. That's fine. Some franchise owners don't mind. However, my franchise, my friend bought it. It still exists today. And about 3 years after I left, it had grown so big it won Best Sales Training Organization in Asia Pacific. So Sandler was wonderful. It's definitely one of the best training programs. It was a nice, methodical approach to sales. And why did I love Sandler versus some of the others? Very much communication skills focused rather than forms. Right? Okay. It's the psychology. I got certified in DISC, neuro-linguistic programming, all this stuff on how can I have a better conversation with you and make you listen to me and really get for you to open up your heart. So I did that, loved it, very restricted to Sandler. When I sold the franchise, I then started doing my own research, and that's when I wrote my first book to put my methodologies down based on some of the stuff I had. Then over time, I created this magazine cover that I'm on next month. I created a sales process, SALES, which is an acronym. That's kind of my methodology that I took from all the wonderful sales processes around the world and kind of dissected them and did that. Why did I publish the book? I make some money from it, but it was more to just share. I use a lot of it more for marketing. They're all available on Amazon and Google Books and all that stuff. But for the most part, I just enjoy doing it because when I write it down, it shows how much I know, and I can share it with others sales training, to be honest, it doesn't work most of the time. I'll be honest. And that's because there's not a lot of accountability at most companies. They all want a quick hit. One of the things Sandler said is, we're not going to come in and do 2-3 day sessions. You want to work with us, it's a year-long program. They do 1 or 2 day sessions if you have a specific need, but they believe in, in order to change behavior, and for a behavioral change, you really need to have what's the word I'm looking for? Reinforcement on a regular basis, right?
Make the habits that underlie
absolutely the behavior. Right. Make the habits change. So that's why I ended up doing that. And it's when it's your passion, you're continually learning. And then the last book I wrote was called The Articulate Financial Advisor, because that was my background really. And I took my second book and kind of just made it a little bit more industry specific. For financial advisors. As you know, in the US, there's quite a few financial advisors around here.
Yep. For sure. Did you feel like the Sandler training is what sort of influenced you to do comedy?
Not really. I'll tell you why.
Tell us about that.
So I've always been, even when I was in college and I was living in Boston, I always did community theater. I was always involved at Creighton. I would do freshman week where we would do plays and events for the freshmen coming in. I did theater. I did some of the plays in high school. I've always had an affinity, but really what got me into comedy is in the early 80s, stand-up comedy. I've always been a fan anyway, since the days of Dean Martin roasts and Don Rickles and all that stuff. But in the early 80s, Boston, even more so than New York, became the comedy hub of the United States. And it really was booming. I never had the courage to do it back then, but I would go to comedy shows multiple times a week on a regular basis. It was just, for me, it was the best thing to do on a Friday, Saturday, Thursday, and just go see these legends. And I knew someday I'd want to do it, but theater is very different because comedy, you're on a stage with a microphone and no one else, right? It's very independent. Right. It's like tennis. There's no one to blame. So when this club opened, I had already been doing consulting, and I thought, well, if I want to teach someone to be more confident in public speaking, what better way than say that I'm on stage regularly doing comedy? So I was blessed that this American-born Chinese had opened the club in Hong Kong. It's called the Takeout Comedy Club, like takeout food. And the Jamie Gong, born and raised in New York, did comedy in the States, moved to Hong Kong, where his parents were from, and started this club, which still exists today. It's phenomenal. And I took his course. He runs a course. And, what's the premise of jokes, how to premise, setup, punchline, and all that. I started doing open mics, and it's taboo. But when I started doing open mics, I just wrote other people's jokes just to see if I could get on stage. And then little by little, it became a passion, and I kept doing it. And my wife thought I was a lunatic, but I couldn't get enough. I started in Hong Kong, performed in Australia, all over Asia. I've performed in Florida, performed at the House of Comedy in Minnesota. And when I was living in Asia, because, branding is funny. I say I was on Comedy Central, which I was, but it was Comedy Central Asia, but it's still Comedy Central. So I don't need to add the Asia at the bit. And then I just found my passion. I still do it today. And there's nothing better for me than getting up on stage, because once your mind figures out how to do things, once you understand the premise of a joke, everything I see and do during the day gives me new premises. And so I now do comedy here. It wasn't as much Sandler. Sandler gave me a lot more confidence, because when I went from banking to training, it really meant that every day I was by myself in front of 20, 30, 50, 60 people. So I'd say I fine-tuned my public speaking skills, definitely. Okay. But the comedy just came from a love of comedy. And again, I was blessed to be in Hong Kong when it was booming. And then there's 3 comedians from Minnesota, actually. I don't know if you've ever heard of Acme Comedy Club in Minnesota.
I think I have.
It's one of the best, and it's owned by a Hong Kong Chinese guy, believe it or not. So they filmed a movie out there in 2015 with Tom Segura, Chad Daniels, and Pete Lee, whose home club was in Acme in Hong Kong. And they had a professional LA producer, and they did a show about comedy in China, Hong Kong, and Singapore. So for the Hong Kong piece, they filmed a ton of things. I didn't know I was going to make it, but I actually got a bit of mine in the movie. So it was just, it's very cool. And when I tell people, I'm not bragging by any means. Anybody can do anything if you do it for 10 years and you do it every day. It's more to say, doing a cold call for me is really not a lot of pressure compared to getting up at the House of Comedy in Minnesota with 300 people staring at me, and all I have is a microphone. So I think the comedy, again, it was the curiosity of, imagine being so powerful imagine the bigwigs nowadays that go to Madison Square Garden and do comedy for 30,000 people. I just find that enviable, because I will never get to that level, but they do it. Right. And I think the comedy came from a love. It's a hobby, and you just got to keep practicing, because I had a lot of shows where almost in tears at the end.
Okay. Very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I've always enjoyed comedians as well. So that's great. I have to ask now about the challenges of doing that in Asia. I mean, because are there cultural differences, and there are some jokes that are off limits, or different types of things? You have to know your audience, right?
You have to know your audience. So when I first started, you have to remember Hong Kong at the time. Well, it still is, although the demographics is changing a bit. Hong Kong was always made up of Hong Kong people who typically most of them were educated in Australia, the UK, or the United States. You had a lot of American expats, a lot of Europeans, a lot of Brits, etc. But that was part of the fun. You do have to know your audience, because there's, but they were so westernized, it was a little bit easier. I have done shows in mainland China. And that is a very different, for example, in mainland China, you could tell one story and walk off stage and they'll be happy. right? They're more storytelling. So someone like a
Okay.
Bill Cosby would do very well up there.
Right.
But our sense of comedy, if you watch the pros now, they're kind of, we say you should get 6 laughs a minute, which means you're getting a laugh every 10 seconds.
Wow.
But what you also learn, just like knowing your audience in sales, is, we have a term called you always punch up, right? You got to be careful. Look at the wokeness we have in this country now.
Yep. You don't want to pick on people beneath you, right?
Exactly. So what ends up happening is the more you get into it, you realize if you make your comedy personal, you'll really never offend anybody. So if I make fun of Italian Americans, no one's going to get mad at me because I am Italian American. Right. If I make fun of living in Boston or being married or being Catholic, these are things so my wife's Methodist, so I have bits about that. I have bits about, now I have jokes about coming back to the States because I struggled when I first moved back here because in Asia, I could say anything. And I'll share a true story with you about knowing your audience. I did a consulting gig with a bank up in Kenosha, Wisconsin, right? Okay. And in one of my training sessions, it was a financial services firm. I used the word virgin. Mm-hmm. And I didn't use it sexually. I don't know why I used it, but I said, oh, so Tim, you're a virgin to this approach to whatever. Sure. And the next day got a call from HR and they fired me as their consultant because some woman was triggered and went to HR and was crying because Anthony used the virgin word or whatever. So it's actually very difficult here, to be honest, more than it was in Asia, because if you understand like the British and Australian and they're much more sarcastic and they give they're much more open.
They have tougher skin.
Whereas here, I did a show here. I volunteered because my friend runs the golf club. It was at a retirement community in Sun City. Okay. And imagine they're eating dinner, 75 to 80-year-olds. And I just bombed because by accident, I was so bored because I wasn't getting any laughs. I decided to do a joke about politics. And let's just say my politics didn't align with the group at the Sun City Grand Community Center. And it really, but you know what? How can you learn if you don't bomb like that, right? How can you learn if you're in sales and you take a rejection as a negative rather than a learning point? How are you ever going to grow? I bombed so many times in the early days. I still bomb today. And you just pray like athletes, if I can kill 75% of my shows, I'm doing pretty well. But you do have to know your audience. I did find it easier in Asia, but coming back here, I've fine-tuned a little bit. So I make it a lot more personal about me but you can't really talk about politics anymore. That's a given right now. Right. I can go ahead.
Well, it's a great transition back to sort of your professional advising and consulting career, because you're always fine tuning and making course adjustments, and the next iteration is better. And without that feedback, and without trying new things and innovation and
absolutely,
and so forth, that's where all the gain is.
If you look at some of the top pros that I've worked with in Asia, I mean, they go to Israel, they go to the war zone, they go to Germany, and when they get off the plane and they get on stage, they're getting laughs in 30 seconds because they're so polished. They know the A material that they can use, and then they practice. That's why in New York, I love it. A lot of the pros will go to clubs late at night. No one knows they're there, and that's where they try their new material for 6 months, and then they pick the A stuff up. But you got to know your audience. I mean, when I was in Asia, if I was doing a training session in India, that's a very different training session than it is in mainland China or Korea or Japan. It's very different. Even if the content is the same, what is your delivery going to be like? How are you going to, how are you going to get people? I mean, the Asian culture, like Korea and Japan, they don't want to talk, but you have to get them to talk. So what's some of the skills you use? And guess what gets people to talk? I've found around the world: humor, laughter, laughter that they can laugh at, not where you're making fun of people. I mean, you've seen a lot of comedians get nailed right now, but you got to be careful. But if you're laughing together with someone, you're probably having a pretty honest conversation.
Right. Okay. Excellent. So a lot of great stuff there. What's on the horizon right now that you're excited about?
The biggest thing, I mean, from a consulting perspective, I'm doing what I love. I'm slowing down. I'm 62, but I still do my consulting because I love that. I love working with people. I love training and development. So I love training. I wouldn't go back to banking from a pure business perspective anymore, but I love training people on the skills that I have, taking the business knowledge and combining it with better skills. So even if I'm training someone on a new wealth management platform, the technology is great, but I come from it more as, what is this technology going to do for you to service your clients better, right? It's not about the bits and bytes, because that's the easy bit. What is this going to do to help you? So from a consulting perspective, I'll continue doing this, get more involved in Arizona now that I'm based here. The Spice Company is growing. I don't spend that much time with it anymore, but it's since got to the point where it's online now. It kind of, I use it more as a way to share things I love. Every time I cook something, I try to use one of my spices so I can put it on the web and share what I do. But the biggest thing on the horizon is, like I said, this festival that was started in Arizona years ago. It went off grid because of COVID for about 4 years. Sure. And we recently brought it back. And like I said, last year we got to the point, last year was the sort of the first year where I got involved heavily. So I was able to get the connections where we had the prize to Hong Kong, which really was very cool, right? A lot of people here have not been overseas, and they get to perform at a great club. But this next year's show, which kicks off in March, there's some big news coming out at that, where last year we did it at a bar. We're still doing some of it at a bar, but this next year, thank God, we're working with the Tempe Improv. So the finals are going to be at the Tempe Improv, where the comedians, that helps me help the local comedians, because then they're really getting exposure, right? There's a lot of bars you can do comedy in, and the prize is still great. So now we're working with the bars to give them some great business and get them involved in the comedy scene. But doing next year's final at the Tempe Improv is going to be a big win for us. And again, I've been back 4.5 years, and I managed to do. I'm in the Ahwatukee and Glendale Times all the time, and my wife's like, "How do you get these articles?" I said, "You've got to give the editor something that's new and exciting that interests them and makes, if I just call and say, 'Hey, we're doing a comedy show, can you get me in the paper?' No. 'Hey, I just moved back from Hong Kong. The first prize this year is a trip to Hong Kong.' I mean, the editor's thinking, man, that's pretty good stuff." So that's what's on the horizon. And, we don't know if Phoenix is going to be our final destination. I also have a home in Marco Island, Florida. I don't know if you know where that is.
Southwest Florida. It's a beautiful area. Yeah.
We got married there and bought a beautiful place on the water on the Gulf.
Nice.
And we'll eventually end up, everybody goes to Florida when they're over 70, right? So,
that's an East Coast thing to say.
Or maybe Arizona. Yeah. Exactly. I know. And again, why I'm here is my mother-in-law's a snowbird. So that's why we picked Arizona when we came back. So I think what's on the horizon, it's interesting. I have so many things going. The horizons, there's a lot of stuff going on, and nice. I have to keep busy. I am not one to sit down and play golf 3 days a week and read the newspaper. That's not my style. I'm still very active. I know I'm only 62, but some people slow down at 62. And my wife's still active. I liked making merchandise for my comedy shows. So guess what I did? I bought a heat press. Now I make all the stuff myself, and
that's fun.
I don't have to pay money to anybody. And little things like that keep me going.
Cool. Excellent. That's all great stuff. Great stuff. So, Anthony, if people want to learn more about you or connect with you, what should they do?
The best place is, aside from my spice, I do have a website for my business and all the stuff that I do, www.anthonysolimini.com. Okay. Everything about me is there. I do other workshops that are fun. Again, I created a wine tasting course called Chateau Lafite, Laugheat. I do wine tastings with a professional sommelier, but I host it to make it fun instead of doing. So all that stuff is on anthonysolimini.com. Everything is there. My contact details. I would love for people to reach out, not for any business stuff, but just get involved in comedy, just get involved in doing something a little bit more interesting that may help them, especially younger kids who I find their communication skills are on their phone, not necessarily doing this.
For sure. Okay. Great stuff. All right. Thank you
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you, Tim. This is wonderful. I love what you're doing. I love sharing, and I look forward to watching many more of your podcasts. And thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for listening and for watching. Thank you, Anthony Solimini, for joining me today. We appreciate you sharing all your stories and insights into success and sales and impact and comedy. It's all great stuff. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Inspired by our guests? Visit phoenixprosperitypodcast.com/guest and join us on the show and share your success story with Tim. The spotlight awaits.